afternoon, and
Hello.
welcome to the podcast. We are currently in San Francisco right now. I don't think that we've ever
No,
recorded in San Francisco.
no, this is new territory.
This is new territory.
Being in the Bay.
My parents are upstairs.
Mm.
This is Aaron's room.
This is where I sleep
This is where he sleeps.
and reside.
We were sitting on his little bed, aka the couch.
And we're here.
I am
And it's
currently.
Thanksgiving.
It was Thanksgiving.
And it's over.
Now it's over. I'm currently experiencing heartburn, actually, right now, from the past 3 days.
Several days of eating. Yeah, it's a weird week where it's just try and true eating until you cannot possibly eat, sleeping as long as you can before you have to go on to the next meal.
Yeah. And I don't think I've really slept.
No. And
But
I'm
you
about
have
to
a little
go
bit.
on a plane.
He's about to go back to check in on Donna.
In an hour and a half.
Yes.
Yep.
So we wanted to do a quick little podcast, a little recap of our week.
Yep.
Before we went our separate ways, because what better time to spend our last few moments together than spend them with you? Yeah. So yesterday.
Kick us off, little girl.
Yesterday, Aaron and I ended up at this neighborhood bar that
The way that Sophia's always talked about San Francisco and living here is like it's a small town. Like that has never been my perception of it growing up.
I want to ask you,
here.
how did you perceive San Francisco
As
before?
a city. As a
Like a New York or an LA?
it was like is a literal in between of the two. Because
Okay.
you have a city with rich history.
Mm-hmm.
It's not densely populated, but there are a lot of people
I think
here.
it used to be more densely populated. I really do.
Still, though, compared to other metropolitan cities, not the case.
Not like New York.
Or even other cities.
LA? I feel like LA is so spread out.
Oh, it's much more densely populated. They pack the people in.
But I think it used to be that way with San Francisco.
Well, then you had the earthquake in the early 1900s, right? What?
I'm talking about right now.
No, but what I'm saying is all the buildings fell, and then they rebuilt, and then COVID, and then tech. You know, a lot of people think about the zoning in San Francisco as like pre the Macintosh and then post the Macintosh. Because that signaled when Silicon Valley erupted into just chaos.
I feel like I really remember that happening, though. I honestly feel...
But that would have been when you were a kid.
I honestly feel a huge difference between San Francisco, and not in the way that I think most people would perceive the difference, that someone on the outside who's like watching the news would perceive the difference. Because I think a lot of people talk about how San Francisco has changed and how they would never live here anymore. And I'm not going to lie, like that upsets me.
Oh, definitely.
And it makes me really angry, because I do feel that I don't know, the people who are saying that also haven't...
They haven't been here.
They haven't grown up here.
Not only that, most people who say that don't even come here.
Yes.
And they haven't come here.
And I will say, here's my perception, and maybe my perception, you know, I don't have a super vast knowledge of the politics of San Francisco.
But you've been here.
But I will just say it from my experience of what I've seen with the city, because
Right.
it is really important to me that I share this, because every time I tell someone I'm from San Francisco, especially if they live in LA, and no hate to LA because I'm currently choosing to live there right now, but I do believe that they're a little bit jealous of the North Bayers, and there's like there's always some shade thrown, whether you go to a San Franciscan and you're like, oh, I'm living in LA. They're like, LA.
Right.
Though, honestly, I feel like New Yorkers throw way more shade at LA.
Oh, definitely.
New Yorkers throw more shade at LA than San Francisco does.
Oh, absolutely.
But LA throws a ton of shade at San Francisco.
It's so funny.
Like, every time I say I'm from San Francisco, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
The homeless.
Yeah. Did you, I mean, I know that you kind of went out in college. Was that the reaction you got, or was it only like a pandemic, post-pandemic
In college, you know what was interesting? And I think it's because, you know, you're spending time... I work at a Pilates studio,
right.
So I'm spending time with a lot of upper class people.
That's true.
And
sure.
in Michigan, I was spending a lot of time with students. It was a public school.
Right.
So the initial reaction that people had when I said I was from San Francisco was, oh, that's super wealthy, bougie, privileged, not aware of anyone.
Do you think that
else.
had to do with pandemic result? And then maybe in college, which was 2018 to 2022, RIP, that was sort of the peak of the boom. 2018 especially, like those 2 years, I feel like really it was at the height of just oversaturation in terms of tech work specifically.
Well, I'll tell you this. I'll explain my experience, and then you can decipher for yourself what you think it's actually from.
Sure.
That difference. Because I do think part of the difference is the group of people who I'm talking to.
Right.
But, I also have college-age people saying to me that, or 30-year-olds saying to me that, San Francisco has changed a lot. And I do think it has changed. This is what I've perceived the change to be. When I left for college, we were starting to really see the effects of tech, because tech had always been there.
Right.
But I think it was really booming when I left for college. I think that the housing market started to become insane when I left. And it already was insane, but it was like, houses in the Sunset District going for millions of dollars, which is just, it's unheard of.
Right.
And that really started when I left for college.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do remember a lot of tech people moving in, and, the prices really fluctuating because of it, because people started overbidding on houses, which had never been heard of in San Francisco before, because they were making so much money, these tech people, that they would to get a house, you would have to overbid on the price that was being listed instead of trying to negotiate.
Sure.
And so I remember that happening. And then I remember when COVID hit, because everyone had moved here for tech. And I remember my dad is a landlord. Everyone, and it's also a very common thing that if you were born and raised in San Francisco and you've been able to stay here, you probably own property.
Yeah, you would have to.
And so a lot of people that I know are like, I'll call us small business landlords, right?
Sure.
And they own property in San Francisco. A lot of people who grew up neighborhood people, all of their buildings are vacant from tech moving out. So I saw it firsthand because my dad was experiencing, all these vacancies. And they were all moving back home because they were allowed to work virtually now.
Right.
And the thing with tech, and I think we talked about it a little bit at dinner the other night, was that why are you going to continue paying rent on a building to have a ton of offices if, you're a smaller tech company, you're on the rise, and you can save that money and just be online?
Or even as an individual, there was this quote, and it's an obnoxious quote, but it's like, oh, I can live elsewhere and still get Bay Area money. So.
And so a lot of, my Uncle Jose, he works in tech.
Right.
And he was saying that he knows a lot of his coworkers now. They live in, somewhere middle America, and they're making tech salaries, and they're able to afford really nice houses. And I feel like that's kind of the only way you can afford homes right now.
Yeah, to buy like a nice new home.
Yes. So I do remember, especially after COVID, coming home, and all of the businesses were closed. And it was dead in San Francisco. I think more than I experienced in Ann Arbor, and more than I experienced. Well, we moved to LA later, but we did go to LA, when I think things were still recovering from COVID, because we went junior year.
Yes.
So I think we would have experienced, LA still seemed very happening to me the whole time.
Yeah.
But I do think, of course,
well, because there's less. It's not a city that is dependent on traffic, movement, people being outside, because no one is ever really outside or walking.
Yeah.
So there's not a perception of difference because everyone's just in their cars.
Yes. And a lot of especially where I'm from in San Francisco, there's a lot of small businesses.
Right.
And a lot of them closed. A lot of restaurants closed. Everything seemed to go out of business. And I really do think that without that traffic of people, without,
Right.
even now,
Things can't sustain
things are
themselves.
closed through multiple days of the week, even
Sure.
still. And I don't think that San Francisco fully recovered from COVID, because I don't think that the business is opened back up. And I
Right.
think that so many people had moved in from tech, taking other people's homes,
Right.
raising the prices so that no one could afford to live here.
Well, it's interesting because when tech first moved in, there's a lot of talk because, San Francisco rose to be the 8th biggest economy, not just in the United States, but the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
So 8th biggest economy in the entire world. San Francisco is not a very big place.
Yeah.
So that
It's 7 by
is
7.
insane, that it raised that much money and there was that much wealth within the confine of a single city. So you're faced with the question of, well, what do we do now? Because this is at a point where it's booming, where people are starting to move in, where businesses are flocking to the city.
I also think, no shade on tech, because I do think it was very important for the city, but it was the culture completely shifted from
Sure.
when I was younger, because I do think there was a lot more value of the arts in San
Yeah.
Francisco.
Oh, it was
there
like-
was a lot more value.
It was
in,
arts central.
It
this
was
is
arts
where
central,
you
and
had
I feel like that totally.
the culture of what became popular in the United States. Most of it, especially when you like in the 70s, 80s, almost all of it that I liked was from here.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a total. And you felt that. I felt that growing up. I felt that sense of like, we would, and my family, they, are into sports, into the arts, but not really. They're not really like aficionados of the arts, but we would
Mhm.
go to the ballet every year.
Sure.
And, we would go to the opera, and we
Right.
would do those things. And we weren't the type of family to like, we would go to whatever play had come to the Orpheum, like that sort of stuff.
Mm.
But it wasn't like we were a family that really sought that out.
Right.
It kind of just was a part of the culture of being
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, and it's a very unusual city in the sense that it grew so quickly,
Mhm.
and there were, like I was saying before, the question then becomes, what do we do now? Because that
Yes.
happened in New York, and what did they do? Well, they thought
With which industry?
just generally.
Like finance, or was it just?
Well, there was finance. There was a lot. New York
because
is just.
I do feel like with San Francisco, like it's so specific to tech.
That's true. It is.
Because I feel like
specific.
it wasn't just like the city grew, because it might have looked that it grew. Like, this is what I'm saying, from people looking on an outside perspective, it might have seemed like San Francisco grew because a ton of people were flooding into San Francisco. The prices were rising, and a lot of wealthy people were coming into San Francisco.
And then
New
the question,
wealth.
But then the question is, how do you manage the wealth, and how do you manage there being new people coming into your city?
Yes.
What do you do?
Yes. And I think what I want to say is I think there already was a lot of wealth in San Francisco before.
Oh, of course.
And I think that there already was a booming city.
Yeah.
But I do think that there was a specific cultural shift. Like,
The cultural shift was there being no culture.
yes. And
Because because the average person in tech who comes here stays for 9 to 12 months and then they leave.
Yes. And that was totally happening. And that's why I think, a lot of the people who were born and raised here, who own property,
who have families here, who grew
have
up
families,
here, who keep the city alive,
but
who keep the culture.
But for example, like what I was saying, like, for a lot of landlords in the city, like my dad,
Right.
like there was just a ton of vacancies during that time, and I feel like when we moved to LA, I was kind of surprised that there were not that many vacancies, because the way that I hear about San Francisco is that there are vacancies all the time.
Well, because no one can afford the price.
Yes.
And because the people who could afford the price, that inflated the price,
Leave.
have been moving out and who leave regularly.
Yes.
And that doesn't leave room for people who want to live here. They can't afford to live here.
I agree.
And what started happening when tech came in is you saw a lot of natives who, rightfully so, didn't want their city to change, right? Because the question is, well, people are moving into the city. We need more buildings. We need more houses. Because otherwise prices inflate. You need to adjust that with cities get more densely populated. That's how it goes.
Yeah.
And that's how it goes in any city, in any big city, in any city that is growing. You need to have more buildings, and you need to scale with, so that you could fit a city that is getting denser and denser. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, what started happening was a lot of people lived here, and rightfully so. You don't want your neighborhood changing. Nobody wants that. There were a lot of, does the not in my backyard sound familiar? NIMBY? I think a lot, you see how like when you drive around, it's a lot of like historic districts, historic buildings. Because if it's historic, you can't change it. You can't add new buildings. You can't take buildings down. You can't make any adjustments to the building because it's a historic building. So a lot of historic blocks, a lot of historic buildings. There was a lot of lobbying for not in my backyard, so that we can't add infrastructure. We can't add more buildings. We're not going to build high rises. We're not going to build more places for people to live, which when you do that, you also get more shops, you get more businesses. So that means the city changes, unfortunately, right? And nobody wants that, especially the people who've always lived there. You don't want to see your city change, but at the same time, if your market is growing and it's growing at a rate that has never happened before, you either have to accept it, and if you deny it, then it seems like this is kind of what happens.
Yeah.
Where the people who, if there's so much competition to then live in the city, the prices go up.
Yeah.
And if it's people who aren't based in the city, who have no relation to the city, they don't have family in the city, who, let's face it, we all know tech people, they're like the worst people on the planet, They like have no ounce of...
He's saying this because he also works in tech.
But they have no ounce of like, there's no sense of...
I will say this because I wanted to comment on... What I mean by a cultural shift also is that I think tech brought a very specific type of culture. And I'm not saying that this is every tech person, but the way that the jobs are set up, you're working virtually from home, so you're staying inside a lot. I think that you're not really tied to the arts in any way.
You don't have any affiliation to the city.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
It's a very isolating, and especially when COVID hit, because everyone was tech, those jobs stayed very individualistic.
Yeah, and
it really didn't feed into the city, and it's also they're based outside of the city, but also
and then you
close
have
enough to the city.
All of these young people who suddenly have more money than they know what to do with it.
Yes.
Right? Who, again, don't have any affiliation to the city, and who are moving into the city and moving in for short periods of time. So they don't come in with the culture, and then they don't leave with it, and then the people come in. It's the same thing. And you saw in COVID, when there were mass layoffs, like Twitter laid off like over half of their staff in a weekend, right? Facebook had mass layoffs, and there's going to be more too. It's only going to continue. Because with AI, they're like, oh, we're going to replace our whole software team. Goodbye. Right? So you see that bubble that was booming, that was certainly oversaturated. I mean, you had people in tech who literally were not working and getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
That's just how much money was supposedly there that was somehow doable for a certain amount of years. Obviously, you can't sustain that. And that's starting to end. There's still a lot of money in it, but that sort of boom where anyone could study computer science for 3 months and then take a test and then maybe be a software engineer at Google, that day is almost over. And unfortunately, because it's not the tech companies who are paying the price, it's not the people who work there who are paying the price. It is...
Well, it is if you're getting laid off. I do.
Of course. But, and I feel bad for those people, obviously, but there are people who are being affected in this city who are getting laid off as a product of those people who are no longer stimulating the economy here. Local businesses that are shutting down.
Yeah.
That are running into debt, that are unable to financially recover, that have to declare bankruptcy because of these people who are making $100,000. I understand that they get laid off, but they'll be okay. You know, maybe some of them won't, but those aren't the people that I feel bad for.
Yeah.
You know, at the same time, they'll be okay. And it's unfortunate because this city has paid the price. And then also on the other end, and this is the part that makes me upset, is when you see a certain, you know, political opposition, because San Francisco is the pinnacle of progression and progressive attitude
agenda.
But also there were so many beautiful like cultural movements here.
Yeah, I agree.
That abided to arts, that abided to, you know, just
civil
acceptance,
rights.
civil rights, all of that shit that was great, and embedded into the city. In the 1 second, and it's not a, and you know, and people can say this is a byproduct of, you know, liberalism, or this is a byproduct of, you know, liberal politics, and maybe that is to a certain extent. I don't know that for sure, but I think you have kind of a blip in time where this city is the collateral for, you know, capital greed, and by big tech, and by these companies who are literally just using a city as an experiment. The experiment didn't go as planned. This city is taking the blame, and people who don't align to the politics of the city are using it to say, well, this is what happens.
Well, it is funny. Actually, I wanted to comment on that because I do, coming back to San Francisco, I feel that I grew up in a very conservative bubble of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that most of the quote unquote locals here, whose parents immigrated here, who are first generations, who grew up here, who raised their kids here, whose kids have stayed here, they buy into that agenda.
Well, how could you not? You know?
No, of course, but it's I think it's sad for me. I think it's sad for me, and it's conflicting for me because I keep hearing all of these things of, oh, well, you got to clean up that city. That's it's like people are shitting on the street kind of city, which right. I'm sorry, people are shitting on the street in any city.
I mean, the idea that anyone I've seen is in a city because it's clean.
No, it's ridiculous.
It's never been the case.
I mean, yeah, you live in the city so that you don't end up like a...
If you don't want a place that changes, you know, people are like, the city changes, and cities change. That's what cities do, and that's why people like them. And, you know, when you see and perceive change, like your favorite store goes out of business, you're like, oh, that sucks. City's changing. But the overall, it's great that it changes and that you're living with people that aren't like you, and you learn how to live with other people.
Yes.
If you didn't want that, and you wanted a place that was clean, and that
then
never
you would
changed,
move out of the city.
you'd live in a suburb.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
Who the hell wants to do that?
Yes. I just think that the dichotomy of living in this city and watching it change and being upset about the change, and not necessarily for the reasons of a change in culture, a change in diversity, because I think that that's always been part of San Francisco in a weird way. Of course. Though also San Francisco, I have always thought, and you can see it in the literal infrastructure of San Francisco, that it's very segregated. That it's very segregated by cultures and by ethnicity, and by neighborhood.
Yes.
You can see it in the way that it's built. But that being said, I think it is really interesting that, you know, the shift that's happening right now in San Francisco, and the way that it does feel like a ghost town when I'm here. And I think that because the businesses are less booming, and because there's not as much activity in San Francisco, your eye is going to be drawn to, you know,
who's in charge.
Yeah.
And what's going on. This is what happens when you have certain people in politics. And I don't think that that's why, right? Because also the answer of picking them all up and putting them somewhere else so we can't see them isn't the answer to.
But I think that whenever you're talking about homeless people,
right,
it's going to be very obvious that if they are the only people who are walking the streets, that there are quote unquote a ton of homeless people.
Right.
I don't think that the fact that people are saying, because they quote unquote cleaned up the city for this event. Yes, this event that's coming, which is very exciting, because I think a lot of people are paying more attention to the city, and a lot of people are excited about it. But when they do say clean up the city, they mean move homeless people out of the city.
Yeah.
And, you know, a friend of mine said to me, oh, yeah, there's no homeless people in the Tenderloin when you go there anymore. I've never known a time in my life where there's not homeless
And
people
let's
in the
break
Tenderloin.
down. Do you know why the Tenderloin is named the Tenderloin?
No.
Because this was like in the 1900s, like the 50s and through the 70s and 80s, when there were brothels and there was illegal activity in that area of town. You had these, these people running illegal businesses or whatever, brothels, etc., going up to cops and saying, "Hey, we'll pay you X, Y, and Z dollars if you don't police this area. If you let us do our thing, we'll keep you on the payroll. You just kind of let us do our thing." And it's called the Tenderloin because the cops were paid so well by the people who ran, illegal businesses that they could avoid Tenderloin. So the name of the area is literally the byproduct of that. So the idea that people are taught, like, they don't understand it,
Yeah.
That's what it's always been. And it doesn't mean that there aren't problems there, but I think social media is a factor in this.
Well, of course. I don't know. I also think that the
But that's always been the case.
idea of a bad neighborhood and a good neighborhood is also just very
I totally agree.
twisted.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And look,
But the
doesn't-
Tenderloin has always been a place where you're not just gonna go for a stroll and walk down the street. And I've never felt safe in the Tenderloin. I'm never going to go to the Tenderloin and be like, oh, I'm just gonna go for a nice little walk in the Tenderloin.
Right.
I think that the fact that is now considered a safe, it's just kind of crazy to me. It's just a crazy thing that they're like, I don't know, quote unquote, cleaning up the Tenderloin, which I know means moving homeless people to a different. Where are they going? Where's everyone going?
What did one of our friends say? He's like, "Oh, I think they moved him to Alcatraz."
What?
It's like, excuse me? What do you mean? First of all,
Alcatraz is a prison.
I don't think that's true. And B, if that were true, that wouldn't be good either.
I don't know. All I'm saying is, yeah. San Francisco does feel like a little bit of a ghost town right now. I also feel like I'm seeing less homeless people than I used to growing up. Personally, maybe it's because my neighborhood has changed.
I mean, I've been coming here consistently for 4 years, and
I think there's less people in general.
Yeah,
it's feeling very empty, and I do think that's a result of not fully recovering from COVID.
Yeah. And look, there are cities that have recovered, right? New York has recovered. There are cities that have done it.
I think New York and LA have both recovered.
And as I was saying about this city, it's unfortunate, but it's taken, I think, extra damage from what surrounds it, and the amount of capital and wealth that it was inundated with out of absolutely nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I mean, not to say there weren't misplays, but unless you play it perfectly, I mean, it has to. I mean, it can't continue forever that way. Yeah, and we'll see, but I think that it's the perception of the city. I frequently get upset by the way people talk about it, because it's also like you don't come here. So anyway, that being said,
yeah, and I agree. You don't live in a city to feel like you are just comfortable in your own little house,
or safe, or you know what I mean. It's like, who feels safe?
That's what I liked in the documentary that we were watching.
Yeah.
We watched the Martin Scorsese
and Fran Lebowitz. Pretend It's
It was like
city.
a little mini-series documentary.
It's great.
And the way that she was just talking about New York,
as someone who's always been there,
it did remind me of, growing up in a city. And even though San Francisco and New York are completely different cities,
they capture the essence of just living in, she's like a metropolitan socialite. So, she's a writer, but she also she hasn't written like a ton of books.
Yeah.
She worked as like a columnist. She's like done things, and she continues to do things. But she's more of like a personality. Does that make sense?
She's a personality.
than, anything else. I mean, she's actually a good writer, but more of just like a commentator. And she does a lot of speaking, at places. She does touring. But yeah, I really liked the way that they kind of made you feel good about, cities change. And this is what it is to live in a city.
Yeah, and she did say something where this was really interesting to me as someone who's just moved to a city, because I also feel that LA is interesting in that even though there is definitely history in LA, it feels like the city tries to hide that.
Yeah, it's not like being in
It's not
any.
interwoven in the city. It's like they tried to paste something over their history.
It's very interesting. I totally agree with you, because it's like you walk around. First of all, like the ultimate example is New York, where you can walk up and down, and everything feels like, you just feel the richness of the architecture of the buildings of like you can feel stimulated by just like walking a few blocks and just looking around. I mean, it's amazing. I feel that way about here too. Honestly.
I do too.
You walk around.
I walked down to the beach today, and I was like, "Oh my god, this is so beautiful."
And even if you walk through the park, and you just see like things that have been there for 100 years, and they do a great job at sort of preserving that while still showing it off. I mean, just the buildings are so iconic. You could see a photo of a building in San Francisco and know exactly that is San Francisco. Like it's it's just so iconic to the city. It just has such great landmarks. And you don't really have that in Los Angeles, where it is just to say that it's one singular city is inaccurate, because it's not. It's a bunch of things.
I also think it is a bit elitist, but it's also, everything around San Francisco is super expensive, sometimes even more expensive than the city itself. And I also think it's similar in New York, where if you say that you're living in, I don't know, Brooklyn, or you're from Long Island, or if you're from Marin, or if you're from Napa, or if you're from the peninsula, right? And some people even give examples that are way further than that.
Right.
You'd say, okay, well, you're not really from the city, though. You weren't born I'm from the city.
Yeah.
Which is fine. There's a whole other thing to that. But
yeah, I think
with LA, I think that you could be outside of the quote unquote city. Like there's not as distinct lines of where the city is.
Yeah, people wouldn't say, "Oh, you live in North Hollywood. You're not."
Yeah, like even the fact that I live in, can I say which area I live in San Francisco?
Yeah.
Like the Sunset District of San Francisco, right? Like that's a very specific spot in the city, but it's not downtown, and even that there's a distinction in that.
Right.
You know what I mean? I don't think it's like that in LA.
I think there's
like east and west
is some of that, but it's less. I think unfortunately it exists because of gentrification.
Yeah.
Because Los Angeles, all cities are gentrified, but Los Angeles, it's very weird, where you can be in a very affluent neighborhood, and then you can drive 2 blocks, and then it's a very poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
Or you could drive 20 minutes, and it's an extremely poor neighborhood. I think that does create some tension, and in LA there has been a lot of tension because of that, because the wealth disparity. I mean, wealth disparities are big in any city, but it's visually so easy to see.
Well, because you're driving through it.
Because you're driving, and yeah, it's.
And also, I do think that there's like not that either is better than the other, but what we were saying about incorporating culture, the history of the city, I think that it's more trendy in per se New York or San Francisco to incorporate the history of where you're living. And I think that with LA, everything is just trendy in LA.
Yeah, or just like
it's like whatever's newest.
Yeah.
So it's whatever's shiny, whatever's newest. And so I think that there's like more of an overwhelming visual disparity.
Yeah, and even like the stuff that looks quote unquote nice, like in our neighborhood, that that 2-bedroom that we saw that they were building,
right?
Which is like literally up for $2.5 million. Mm-hmm. You look at that and you go, that looks like someone went to IKEA and you bought a house at IKEA.
It does.
It's
not. It doesn't look like they're trying. There's really not a lot of like.
And there's no preservation.
Yes,
one thing that I liked
or aesthetic to the city.
One thing I really liked about the documentary that we watched was one thing that she was saying, which was the skyscraper was invented in New York City.
Yeah.
The skyscraper was invented in New York City, and everywhere around the world started copying New York and the architecture. So you see skyscrapers everywhere, in every city. You see them in the Middle East. You see them in Saudi Arabia. You see them in Dubai. And then somewhere along the way, for some reason, you see on like Billionaires Row, like on 56th Street by like Central Park, you'll see these like really high skyscrapers. And they don't look like New York because for some reason, like through this mix, you saw people copying the infrastructure in New York. And then you see these big skyrises in Dubai. And then for some reason, New York copied Dubai, who copied New York.
Yes.
And you see this sort of, it looks different.
Yeah.
It looks different. And, I think that that's like a very small example of like a very obvious change. It's like, that building doesn't look like it belongs here, in a city where everything kind of blends in really beautifully. And I think that that's true in a lot of places. And in LA, it's unapologetic, where it's like, nothing was here. Let's put up an IKEA house,
Yeah. And I do, what I appreciate about the documentary is that she said something like, when I first moved to New York, and she wasn't born and raised in New York. She moved there,
Jersey.
In her...
Yeah, when she was in high school.
Right. Okay.
So
she's been there for years and years and years and years and years. She basically grew up there, right? I mean...
Yeah.
But what she did say was that, I would say that this is New York has changed. This was the old New York. But then the old New York, or the old version of that city, it occurs in a time of whenever that person moved there.
Yeah,
so what she was saying is the people living in New York now, she kept going on about how they put up like these little lawn chair statues in Times Square, and that the people living in New York now, the people who have just moved there and are starting their lives there, are going to say, well, when they take out those lawn chairs. Though that was the old New York, that was the classic New York, and they took out the lawn chairs.
Right.
And I totally, I see that with this city too.
Yeah, with any city, it's like, it's how you grew up. And then that's your perception of what it's always been.
Yes.
And that's a great observation. And I think that that's entirely true. You only know what you've experienced.
Yeah.
And what's so great about cities and why I love cities is because they're always changing and because everyone is somehow living together. But yeah, anyway, it's cool, man. I love cities. I love this city.
I love this city too, and I'm proud to be from this city. And it is weird because I feel like I was always trying to leave this city.
Yeah.
And now I have a weird relationship with it when I come back. Especially, I think, with all the negative talk around San Francisco, I feel very protective over it. Like, I feel like that's my... Hi.
Whoa, look who's in here. Oh, look who got it. Look who got them. She got the earrings. She lost her earrings. There's a bit of a... tussle, but we got him back.
Hi, you guys.
Oh,
it's me.
Let me turn this up.